Shalom. This is the first video that will provide irrefutable proof that Jesus, or Yahshua, as his Hebrew name is, rose from the dead, that the resurrection actually occurred. I just want to preface this by saying that it's very important to understand that in order to prove that the resurrection occurred, you do not need to assume that the New Testament is inspired by God or that it's even trustworthy. Okay, you don't need that. Now, of course, I do believe that the New Testament, the Brit Hadashah, the Renewed Covenant, I do believe that it is true, but you do not need to believe that it is true in order to prove that Jesus resurrected, that he rose from the dead. Okay, the first truth is the empty tomb. This is the fact that we have. The tomb in which Jesus was buried was discovered empty by a group of women on the Sunday following the crucifixion. Okay, what evidence do we have that the tomb in which Jesus was buried was discovered empty by a group of women on the Sunday following the crucifixion? Well, the first piece of evidence we have is the resurrection was preached in the same city where Jesus, Yahshua, had been buried shortly before. Yahshua's disciples did not go to some obscure place where no one had heard of Jesus to begin preaching about the resurrection, but instead they began preaching in Jerusalem, the very city where Yahshua had died and been buried. They could not have done this if Yahshua was still in his tomb. No one would have believed them. No one would have been foolish enough to believe a man had raised from the dead when his body lay dead in the tomb for all to see. I mean, think about it. All the Jews would have to do, all the Romans would have to do, is just go to the tomb and say, excuse me, his body's right here. What these guys are saying is false. There's a scholar, his name's Paul Alphaeus. It's spelled Paul, like Paul, P-A-U-L, and his last name is A-L-T-H-A-U-S. He writes, the resurrection proclamation could not have been maintained in Jerusalem for a single day, for a single hour, if the emptiness of the tomb had not been established as a fact for all concerned. The second piece of proof is the earliest Jewish arguments against Christianity admit the empty tomb. If you read Matthew chapter 28, verses 11 through 15, there is a reference made to the Jews' attempt to refute Christianity by saying that the disciples stole the body. Now this is significant because it shows that the Jews did not deny the empty tomb. Instead, their stolen body theory admitted the significant truth that the tomb was in fact empty. Now, you don't have to rely on the book of Matthew. So if you don't believe the Bible is true, you don't have to rely on the book of Matthew to establish this. The Toledoth Jesu, okay, that's spelled T-O-L-E-D-O-T-H, Jesu, J-E-S-U. I'll put that in the information at the bottom of this YouTube. It's a compilation of early Jewish writings, is another source acknowledging this. It acknowledges that the tomb was empty and attempts to explain it away. Further, we have a record of a 2nd century debate between a Christian and a Jew in which a reference is made to the fact that the Jews claimed the body was stolen. So it's pretty well established that the early Jews admitted the empty tomb. Now, why is this so important? Remember that the Jewish leaders were completely opposed to Christianity. They were hostile witnesses. In acknowledging the empty tomb, they're basically admitting the reality of a fact that was certainly not in their favor. So why would they admit that the tomb was empty unless the evidence was too strong to be denied? There's a man named Dr. Paul Maier. His last name is spelled M-A-I-E-R. He calls this positive evidence from a hostile source. In essence, if a source admits a fact that is decidedly not in its favor, the fact is genuine. Third, the empty tomb account in the Gospel of Mark is based upon a source that originated within 7 years of the event it narrates. This places the evidence for the empty tomb too early to be legendary and makes it much more likely that it is accurate. What is the evidence for this? I'm going to list 2 different pieces here. First, there's a German commentator on Mark. His name is Rudolf Pesch. The last name is spelled P-E-S-C-H. He points out that this pre-Markan source never mentions the high priest by name. This implies that Caiaphas, who we know was high priest at that time, was still high priest when the story began circulating. For if it had been written after Caiaphas' term of office, his name would have had to have been used to distinguish him from the next high priest. But since Caiaphas was high priest from AD, basically in the early 1st century, for from basically 80, within the first 30 years of the first century. The story could not have begun circulating any later than the very beginning of that first century. Furthermore, this man Persh argues that since Paul's traditions concerning the Last Supper, which are written in 1 Corinthians 11, presuppose the Markan account, this implies that the Markan source goes right back to the early years of Christianity. So the early source Mark puts the testimony of the empty tomb too early to be legendary. Fourth, the empty tomb is supported by the historical reliability of the burial story. New Testament scholars agree that the burial story is one of the best established facts about Yahshua, about Jesus. One reason for this is because of the inclusion of Joseph of Arimathea as the one who buried Christ. Now, Joseph, he was a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, okay? That's like the Jewish Supreme Court of the first century. And people on this ruling class were simply too well known for fictitious, legendary stories to just be invented about them, so that people would believe it. It couldn't happen. This would have been exposed, and then the Christians would have been shown as frauds right at the very beginning of the first century. So they couldn't have circulated as a story about Joseph of Arimathea burying Jesus unless it was true. Also, if the burial account was legendary, one would expect to find conflicting traditions, like a lot of different versions of the story, but we don't have any of those at all. Okay, so how does the reliability of Jesus' burial argue that the tomb was empty? Because the burial account and empty tomb account have grammatical and linguistic ties, indicating that they are one continuous account. So basically, if the burial account is accurate, the empty tomb is likely to be accurate as well. Further, if the burial account is accurate, then everyone knew where Jesus was buried. This would have been decisive evidence to refute the early Christians who were preaching the resurrection. For if the tomb had not been empty, it would have been evident to all, and the disciples would have been exposed as frauds, or at worst, basically insane. Fifth, Jesus' tomb was never venerated as a shrine. Now, this is very important. It's important to realize that in the first century, there was a custom to set up a shrine at the site of a holy man's bones. Okay, so whenever someone believed that someone had lived a holy life, and at the site of where their bones was buried, they would set up these shrines, and that was a very common custom in the first century. There were at least 50 such shrines in the early first century, but there was no such shrine ever erected for Jesus, so it suggests that his bones weren't there. 6, Mark's account of the empty tomb is simple and shows no signs of legendary development. Now, this is very, very apparent when you compare it with the Gospel of Peter, which is a forgery. It's this legend that was written about 125 CE. This legend of the Gospel of Peter, it has all of the Jewish leaders and Roman guards and many people from the countryside. They're gathered to watch the resurrection, and then these three men come out of the tomb, and their heads are reaching up to the clouds, and then there's this talking cross that comes out of the tomb. I mean, it's a legend. You can tell. It's just a silly fabrication. But you don't see any of that type of thing in Mark's account of the empty tomb, or anywhere else in the Gospels for that matter. 7th, the tomb was discovered empty by women. Now this is extremely important and probably some of the most compelling evidence. The testimony of women in first century Jewish culture was considered worthless. Okay, if the empty tomb were a legend, then it most likely that the male disciples would have been made the first to discover the empty tomb, because this would give the legend or the made-up story more credibility. The fact that despised women, whose testimony was deemed worthless, were the chief witnesses to the fact of the empty tomb can only be plausibly explained if, like it or not, they actually were the discoverers of the empty tomb. Okay? So that's extremely important to understand this. I mean, in the first century Jewish culture, in the first century Roman culture, I mean, the testimony of a woman was basically deemed worthless. So if this story had just been invented, why would they say women discovered the tomb? It would make no sense. Because of the strong evidence of the empty tomb, most recent scholars do not deny it. There's a man named D.H. Van Dalen. His last name is spelled D-A-A-L-E-N. He said, "It is extremely difficult to object to the empty tomb on historical grounds. Those who deny it do so on the basis of theological or philosophical assumptions." Another man named Jacob Kremer, his last name is K-R-E-M-E-R, who has specialized in the study of the resurrection and is a New Testament critic, has said, by far, most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb. And then he lists, 28 scholars to back up his fantastic claim. Now, of course, I'm sure that a lot of you listening to this YouTube, you've heard of like the various theories used to explain away the empty tomb, such as that the body was stolen. But those theories are laughed at today by all serious scholars. In fact, they've been considered dead and refuted for almost 100 years now. And let me just give you some examples as to why this is. The Jews or the Romans had no motive to steal the body. Okay, they wanted to suppress Christianity, not encourage it by providing it with an empty tomb. Okay, so they would have had no motive to steal that body. In fact, they had every motive to simply produce the body, take the body out of the tomb, and parade it before everyone in public to prove that these Christians were insane, that they were frauds. But they never did that. Now, the disciples had no motive either to steal the body. Because of their preaching on the resurrection, they were beaten, killed, and persecuted. So why would they go through all of that for a deliberate lie? I mean, in other words, if they had stolen the body and then burned it somewhere or whatever, show me an evidence of a single human being in all of history that has ever knowingly gone through torture and died for something they knew to be a lie. You won't find that anywhere. No serious scholars hold any of these theories today. So what explanation then do the critics offer? Well, basically, they are self-confessedly without any explanation to offer. There is simply no plausible natural explanation today to account for Jesus' tomb being empty. If we deny the resurrection of Yahshua, we are left with an inexplicable mystery. The resurrection of Yahshua, Jesus, is not just the best explanation for the empty tomb, it is the only explanation for the empty tomb. Okay. Yahshua is the King of Kings. He's the Lord of Lords. We all have been wicked. We've all turned astray. We need his blood atonement to cover our lives. And we need his word, his commandments, to show us how to live righteously, that we can put a smile on his face. We can only do this by being forgiven of our sins through his blood and by being filled with his Holy Spirit, that we can walk in his Torah, in his commandments. This is the only way. This is the first video now proving irrefutable proof that Yahshua did rise from the dead. More videos will be coming out shortly. Shalom. The website is www.spiritandtorah.com.